All right, ready to dive in. Today we're tackling something pretty crucial, the world of pharmaceutical regulations. Specifically, we're looking at FDA 21 CFR Part 211, Subpart I, the heart of laboratory controls. You might be thinking, regulations, how thrilling. But truly, this is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to making sure every medication you take is both safe and effective.
It's fascinating, The subpart isn't just about the science itself. It's about making sure that science is used in a really controlled and documented way. It's about knowing that each test result is reliable and can be reproduced, which ultimately protects public health.
Exactly. It's like peeking behind the curtain to see the quality control that goes into every single pill or injection. We've got a ton of sources here to help us break it down. Excerpts straight from the regulations, some pretty eye-opening training videos, and even a look at those infamous FDA warning letters, all focusing on Subpart I.
And one thing that really jumps out at you from these warning letters is that over 55% of the ones sent to dietary supplement companies, they're all about specs and testing. That's a huge number. Really emphasizes how important this subpart is, even for products we don't always think of as needing that level of rigorous oversight.
You're right. It's easy to assume that regulations are just for those prescription drugs, but clearly the FDA is looking out for consumers across the board. So let's dig into what Subpart I actually covers. Where do we even start?
Well, to really understand Subpart I, you got to go back to the foundation it's built on, current good manufacturing practices, or CGMP for short. It's all laid out in 21 CFR Part 110. Think of it as the commandments of the pharmaceutical world. Everything from how clean the facilities need to be to controlling those tiny microorganisms, it's all in there.
Okay, so CGMP is the big picture, the overarching set of rules, and then Subpart I zeroes in on the laboratory specifically. Is that right?
Precisely. Subpart I takes a deep dive into all those lab operations, starting with the lab itself. Even something as basic as ventilation, it's regulated. The fans have to be positioned in a way that minimizes the risk of contamination for those medications.
Wow, I never even considered that. So it's not just about having all the fancy equipment, it's about controlling the entire environment.
Right, you got it. And speaking of equipment, Subpart I doesn't just say use a microscope. It outlines very specific standards for how to calibrate it, how to maintain it, and how to document everything for each piece of equipment used in that lab. No room for error. It's all about eliminating those variables and making sure every test is done under controlled conditions.
That's incredible, the level of detail they go into. It really shows how seriously the FDA takes its role in safeguarding these medications.
Yeah.
And I bet all that control, it leads to a ton of paperwork, right?
You bet. Documentation is a cornerstone of Subpart I. It's not just about generating more paper, it's about creating a transparent record that you can trace for every single activity that happens in the lab. We're talking batch records, sample submissions, chain of custody, a whole trail of paper, all to ensure accountability.
So if there's ever a problem, investigators can literally retrace their steps all the way back to the source. That's impressive.
Precisely. And it's not just about finding problems after they've already happened. All this meticulous documentation actually helps prevent errors from happening in the first place by really encouraging a culture of carefulness and attention to detail.
That makes perfect sense. If you know everything you do is being recorded, you're a lot less likely to cut corners or make mistakes. So we've covered the lab itself and the documentation, but what about the science behind those tests?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. Subpart I mandates that every single test method used in the lab has to be scientifically valid. And the FDA isn't messing around with that term. They actually define it very precisely in the preamble to the regulations.
Okay, so scientifically valid. What does that actually mean in practice? I mean, what do labs have to do?
Basically, it means a test method has to be proven to be accurate, precise, specific, and robust. It needs to produce consistent, reliable results that actually mean something, regardless of who's performing the test or what equipment they're using.
So you can't just have a test, you have to actually prove that it works and prove it works reliably every single time.
Exactly. Think of it like a detective solving a case. They need solid evidence. They can't just go off of hunches. So labs have to demonstrate with data that their methods are up to par.
Wow, sounds like a lot of work. Can you give us an example of how they might prove a method is scientifically valid?
Absolutely. One common technique is called spiking. Let's say you're testing for a specific impurity in a drug substance. You take a known amount of that impurity and add it to a sample of the drug. Then you run the test to see if it can accurately detect the amount you added.
So it's like setting a trap for the test method, seeing if it can catch that known amount of impurity.
Exactly. And this is just one of the many ways that labs can demonstrate that their methods are valid. The key takeaway here is that Subpart I sets a really high bar for scientific rigor. It's all about making sure that the data coming out of these tests is trustworthy and can be relied on to make those critical decisions about drug quality and safety.
Okay, so we've got the lab set up, we've got the documentation, we've got scientifically valid methods. What else does Subpart I cover?
Well, once a drug is made and tested, it needs to be stored properly to make sure it stays potent and safe until it gets to the patient. That's where stability studies come in.
Right. I've always wondered how they figure out those expiration dates on medications. It's not like food where you can just smell it and see if it's gone bad.
Exactly. Subpart I outlines how companies have to conduct these rigorous stability studies. They store samples of the drug under a bunch of different conditions, extreme temperatures, humidity, light, you name it. It's all to see how the drug holds up over time. This helps determine that expiration date so you know you're getting a safe and effective product every time.
So they're basically fast-forwarding the aging process to see how the drug behaves months or even years down the line. Pretty cool.
It is. And one thing I find really fascinating is that there are actually different types of stability studies, like a cycling study where they expose the drug to fluctuating temperatures just to see how it handles those changes. It's all about simulating real-world conditions to make sure the quality stays consistent.
Sounds like there's a lot more to stability testing than meets the eye. And speaking of things we don't always think about, what about those little packets of desiccant we find in some medication bottles? Are those part of Subpart I as well?
Well, Subpart I doesn't actually call out desiccants specifically, but it does talk about container closure systems and the need to protect drugs from degradation. So those desiccants, they play a crucial role in keeping those moisture-sensitive medications stable.
Ah, so it's all connected. It's incredible to see how all these different pieces come together to create such a comprehensive system for ensuring drug quality and safety.
And that's what makes Subpart I so compelling. It's not just a bunch of random rules, it's a whole framework, a holistic approach that considers every single aspect of how the laboratory contributes to protecting public health. Thinking about all these tests and procedures, one thing that really strikes me is the sheer volume of materials involved. I mean, think of all the ingredients that go into making just one medication. Each and every one needs to be rigorously tested before it can even be considered for use.
Right. It's not like baking a cake where you just grab a bag of flour off the shelf and call it a day. Every single component of a drug needs to be so carefully examined to make sure it meets those strict specifications we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And Subpart I doesn't just say test the ingredients. It lays out specific guidelines for how those tests should be conducted, what criteria they have to meet, and even how the results should be documented. It's incredibly detailed.
So it's like having a recipe for quality control, making sure every ingredient is measured, mixed, and tested in a way that guarantees consistency and safety, right?
Precisely. And it goes beyond just testing the individual ingredients in isolation. Subpart I also addresses the testing of in-process materials. Those mixtures and concoctions that are created during the different stages of drug manufacturing.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're not just checking the ingredients at the beginning, they're actually monitoring the quality of the product throughout the entire manufacturing process.
Exactly. Think of it like, well, we were talking about baking a cake earlier, right? You could start with the best ingredients in the world, but if you overmix the batter or bake it at the wrong temperature, that final product is going to be a disaster.
I see what you mean. So these in-process tests, are they like quality checkpoints along the way, making sure that the drug is being manufactured according to plan and catching any potential issues early on?
Exactly. Subpart I actually outlines the specific tests that need to be performed at each stage of manufacturing. This ensures that the drug product consistently meets those predefined specifications.
Wow, it's really incredible how much thought and detail goes into every single step of this process. I can only imagine all this testing generates a ton of data. How do they even begin to make sense of it all?
That's where the power of data analysis really comes into play. Subpart I doesn't just say collect data. It emphasizes how important it is to have qualified people who can actually interpret those results. They need to identify trends, anomalies, anything out of the ordinary. And they have to make informed decisions based on what they find.
So it's not just about having all the fancy equipment and following the procedures. It's about having those skilled scientists who can actually understand what the data is telling them.
Exactly. They're like detectives, piecing together those clues from all the test results, making sure the drug product meets those strict quality standards. And if they see something that looks off, they have to trigger an investigation, figure out what went wrong, and of course, how to fix it.
Sounds like a pretty high-stakes game of scientific problem solving.
Yeah.
And I bet all that data analysis, well, it leads to even more documentation, right?
You got it. Every investigation, every deviation, every single corrective action, it's all documented meticulously. It creates a comprehensive record of everything the lab does, proof of their commitment to quality and compliance.
It's like a scientific journal that's documenting every twist and turn on this journey to create a safe and effective drug. Speaking of which, we've talked about testing ingredients, testing in-process materials. What about testing the final drug product itself?
Ah, yes, the grand finale. Testing that finished drug product is absolutely critical for ensuring it meets all those required specifications and is actually ready to be released to the market.
So it's like the final quality check before the drug is packaged up and shipped out to all the pharmacies and hospitals.
Precisely. And Subpart doesn't mess around. It outlines a whole set of tests that need to be performed on the finished drug product, covering everything from its identity and purity to its potency and even how stable it is.
So they're basically making sure that the final product, the one that's going out, matches the blueprint, that it's got the right ingredients in the right amounts, and will actually perform the way it's supposed to.
Exactly. And all those tests, they're conducted using the same scientifically valid methods we discussed earlier. That's what ensures the results are accurate and reliable and can be trusted when it comes to making decisions about the drug's quality and safety.
It's really incredible how all these pieces work together,
Yeah.
from testing individual ingredients to monitoring the manufacturing process and then evaluating the final product. It's like this amazing symphony of quality control, each instrument playing its part to create a safe and harmonious medication.
And that's one of the things that makes Subpart I so remarkable. It's not just a bunch of isolated rules, it's this comprehensive framework that takes into account every single aspect of how the laboratory contributes to protecting public health.
Okay, so we've covered the testing of ingredients, in-process materials, and the finished drug product. What else falls under that Subpart I umbrella?
Well, there's one more very critical piece to this puzzle we need to talk about, and that's managing those reserve samples. They're like little time capsules for pharmaceuticals, preserving a snapshot of the drug's quality at a specific moment in time.
So they're essentially setting aside samples from each batch of the drug and storing them under very controlled conditions. Why is that so important?
Well, imagine a scenario where years down the line, questions come up about a drug's quality. Maybe there's a suspicion that a particular batch was contaminated or that something went wrong in the manufacturing process.
Oh, that's a little scary. So having those reserve samples would allow them to go back and test the drug from that specific batch to see if there were any issues.
Exactly. It's like having a backup copy of your computer's hard drive. If something crashes, you can always restore it to a previous state.
That's a great analogy. So these reserve samples are like insurance policies for drug quality, ensuring that even years later, we can verify the integrity of that particular batch.
Precisely. And Subpart I, it outlines specific requirements for how these reserve samples should be managed. Everything from the storage conditions to the labeling, even to the documentation that needs to be kept, it's all spelled out.
So it's not as simple as just tossing a sample in a drawer and forgetting about it.
Yeah.
There's this whole system in place to make sure these reserve samples are protected and available if they're needed.
Exactly. It's all part of creating that truly robust and reliable system for safeguarding drug quality and, of course, for protecting public health.
We've talked a lot about the specific requirements of Subpart I, but I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges that labs face when they're trying to comply with all of these regulations?
That's a great question. One of the biggest hurdles is just keeping up with the constantly changing regulations. I mean, the FDA is always issuing new guidance documents, clarifying existing rules, and adapting to the newest advancements in science and technology.
So it's not a one-and-done situation.
Right.
Labs need to be on their toes, staying up to date on the latest developments.
Exactly. It takes a lot of training, education, and professional development to make sure that everyone working in the lab is up to speed on the current requirements.
And I imagine technology plays a big role in all of this, too. With all the sophisticated equipment and computer systems used in labs these days, staying on top of software updates and validation requirements must be a constant challenge.
Well, absolutely. Validating those computerized systems is a critical part of Subpart I, and it can be a complex and time-consuming process. But it's absolutely essential to make sure that the data coming from those systems is reliable and trustworthy.
It sounds like it's a never-ending game of catch-up, trying to stay ahead of the technology curve while still adhering to these strict regulatory requirements.
Precisely. And it really requires a strong partnership between the lab staff, IT professionals, and quality assurance personnel. They all have to work together to make sure that all those systems are operating within the parameters set by Subpart I.
Sounds like a true team effort. And speaking of teamwork, another challenge I imagine labs face is managing all that documentation we talked about before. With so many records to create, review, and archive, it must be a logistical nightmare.
You're absolutely right. Maintaining that kind of robust documentation system is essential for complying with Subpart I, but it can be a very daunting task. It takes a well-defined system for document control, storage, and retrieval, not to mention a dedicated team of people to manage this critical part of laboratory operations.
So it's not just about scribbling notes on a piece of paper and shoving it in a file somewhere. There's a whole science to managing those records effectively and making sure they're accurate, complete, and easy to find when needed.
Exactly. It's an integral part of building that culture of quality within the lab. Documentation is a valuable tool. It provides transparency, traceability, and promotes continuous improvement.
All right, so we've talked about the challenges, but let's look at the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
What are some of the rewards or benefits the labs experience when they successfully implement and follow those Subpart I principles?
Well, one of the biggest benefits is the increased confidence they have in the quality and reliability of their data. When a lab knows it's operating in compliance with Subpart I, they can be confident their test results are accurate, can be reproduced, and meet those regulatory standards.
So it's like a seal of approval, validation, that their work is top-notch, that the data coming out of their lab can be trusted to make important decisions about drug safety and how well it works.
Exactly. And that confidence translates into some real, tangible benefits. Less risk of regulatory action, fewer product recalls, and overall improvement in the efficiency of drug development.
So it's not just about avoiding getting penalized. It's about creating a better, more reliable system that ultimately benefits everyone, both the company and the patients who rely on their medications.
Precisely. And it's about fostering a culture of quality, where everyone in the lab, from the analysts to the managers, takes responsibility for their role in making sure that every test result is accurate, reliable, and ultimately contributes to the safety and well-being of those patients.
That's a really powerful message. And, you know, one thing that really struck me when I was going through these materials was the absolute importance of human expertise in all of this. We can have all the fancy equipment and procedures in the world, but without skilled, dedicated people working in the lab, it wouldn't mean a thing.
You're absolutely right. That human element, it's at the very heart of Subpart I. It's about having qualified people who truly understand the science, who are incredibly meticulous in their work, and are committed to upholding those high standards of quality and integrity.
So it's not just about blindly following rules. It's about having a real passion for the work, a dedication to doing things right, and a deep understanding of how impactful these tests and results can be on people's lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that every single sample, every test, every data point, it all represents a potential life saved, a life improved. That's a powerful motivator for doing things the right way, going above and beyond, and making sure every aspect of those lab operations is done with the utmost care and precision.
It's a good reminder that behind all those regulations and technical details, there's a very human story, a story of scientific discovery, of unwavering commitment, and a shared responsibility to protect public health.
And that's what makes this deep dive into Subpart I so fascinating. It's a glimpse into a world that most people never see, but one that has a profound impact on every single one of us.
It really is. It reminds us that behind every medication we take, every pill, every injection, there's a whole team of dedicated people working tirelessly to make sure it's both safe and effective. That's something worth celebrating.
Absolutely. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll be looking at some specific examples that really illustrate how Subpart I plays out in the real world. We'll be highlighting the challenges, the successes, and how this critical regulatory framework continues to evolve.
Stay tuned. It's about to get even more interesting. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
But you mentioned real-world examples.
Mhm.
Could you give us some specifics where Subpart I has really made a difference?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the testing of dietary supplements. Remember we talked about that statistic earlier where over 55% of those FDA warning letters to supplement companies, they were all about specs and testing.
Yeah, that was pretty eye-opening. But I'm still not totally clear on why supplements are held to these standards. I mean, they're not prescription drugs.
That's a really common misconception. While it's true that supplements don't have to go through the same intense pre-market approval process as drugs, they still fall under the FDA's oversight. And Subpart I provides a really crucial framework for making sure they're both safe and high quality, especially when it comes to that lab testing.
So even though I can just grab them off the shelf, the FDA is still making sure companies are accountable for what's actually in those bottles.
Absolutely. And all those warning letters, they send a pretty clear message that the FDA is serious about enforcing these regulations, even in industries that, might seem a little less regulated than traditional pharmaceuticals.
Knowing that makes me feel a lot better. It's all about protecting consumers in the end, right?
Exactly. And it just highlights how those Subpart I principles, the scientific rigor, the documentation, that quality control, it all goes beyond just prescription meds. It's about making sure people can trust a whole range of
Okay,
products.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
Do you have any other specific examples where some part I has played a key role?
Sure. One case that comes to mind involved a manufacturer who was having some real trouble with their stability testing. They were getting inconsistent results, which was obviously concerning because it raised questions about how stable their drug product was over time.
Oh, that sounds like a big problem. If you're getting inconsistent results, that could mean the drug won't be as effective, or
Yep.
worse, could even be dangerous after a while, right?
Exactly. But luckily, they had a really robust system in place that was aligned with Subpart I, so they were able to quickly identify what was causing the problem. Turned out to be a faulty piece of equipment they were using in their testing.
So they caught it before it became a bigger issue because they were following Subpart I guidelines,
Yeah.
and they had all the documentation and procedures in place.
Exactly. They were able to replace that faulty equipment, revalidate their testing method, and prove to the FDA that they had everything under control.
That's a perfect example of how following Subpart I can actually prevent potentially harmful products from getting out there on the market.
It really is. And it shows how these regulations, even though they seem complicated and maybe a bit demanding, they're really designed to protect everyone.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, companies that invest in quality systems and really adhere to Subpart I, well, they can avoid a lot of headaches down the road.
Absolutely. And it's not just about preventing problems. Subpart I also encourages that idea of continuous improvement. Companies are always looking for ways to refine their processes, make their testing methods even better, and strengthen their whole quality system.
So it's not just about checking off boxes and doing the bare minimum. It's about striving to be better and constantly raising that bar for quality.
Exactly. And that pursuit of excellence, it benefits everyone. The companies, the regulators, and of course, most importantly, the patients who rely on these medications.
That's a great point. Well, this has been incredibly informative. It's amazing to hear about all the work that goes into ensuring medications we take are safe and effective.
It truly is a testament to the dedication of so many people. The scientists, analysts, quality assurance folks, the regulators, they're all working together to protect public health.
And thanks to regulations like Subpart I, we can feel confident in those medications, knowing they've been thoroughly tested and held to the highest possible standards.
It's a system that never stops evolving, always adapting to those new challenges, always looking to improve. But at its heart, it's all about that commitment to scientific rigor, that meticulous documentation, and a shared responsibility for keeping everyone safe.
That's a powerful message to end on. So, to our listeners, the next time you pick up a prescription, take a moment to appreciate the intricate web of science, regulations, and all that human expertise that went into making that medication safe and effective.
And remember, Subpart I is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Keep learning, keep exploring, keep asking questions about this fascinating world of pharmaceutical regulations.
Until next time, keep diving.